All right, well, you're turning to Luke 10. Just imagine for a second that I'd come up this morning and simply said this: today I'm not going to preach a sermon. It's just going to be silent in this room for the next 20 or 30 minutes, which maybe some of you would love, but it's just going to be quiet in here for 20 or 30 minutes. And at the end of 30 minutes, I want you to come up with this. What are the top 3 or 4 priorities in my life? What are the things that are most important to me? How would you even begin to answer a question like that? And if we're being honest, I think really we could come up with 2 sets of answers. The first set of answers being the things that should be most important to us. And then if we really thought about it, secondly, the things that actually are most important to us when you look at the way that we're living our lives. There's a couple questions I think you could ask to try and get at the heart of this. What are my priorities? What's most important to me? You could simply ask this: what do I spend most of my time doing? What has the biggest percentage of my schedule? What do I spend most of my money on? That maybe when my mind starts to wander throughout the day, where does it go? I had someone tell me that when your mind just kind of shuts down and you just let your thoughts go, your priorities and the things that you care about have a way of kind of coming to the surface at that point. Maybe one of the scariest ways we could discover what our priorities actually are is to ask the people closest to us. What does our spouse think our priorities are? What do our kids think our priorities are? Or our friends and the people closest to us? I ran across a thought experiment this week proposed by a former Yahoo executive, Tim Sanders. I think this is actually fairly solid advice. And he was just talking about how he helps people conceptualize what should be most important to them. He writes this. He says, take your life and all the things that you think are important and put them in one of 3 categories. The 3 categories are represented by 3 items: glass, metal, and rubber. The things that are made of rubber, when you drop them, they'll bounce back. Nothing really happens with these kinds of things getting dropped. So for instance, and I enjoy sporting events, if I miss a Seahawks game, my life will bounce back just fine. It doesn't change anything and nothing is lost. Me missing a game or a season of football will not alter my marriage or my spiritual life. I can take it or leave it. Things are made of metal, and when you drop them, they create a lot of noise, but you can recover from the drop. You miss a meeting at work, and you can get the Cliff Notes. You forget to balance your checkbook and lose track of how much you have in your account, and the bank lets you know you've been spending a little more than you have. That's going to create a little bit of noise in your life, but you can recover from it. Then there are things made of glass, he writes, and when you drop one of these, it will shatter into pieces and never be the same. Even though you can piece it back together, it will still be missing some pieces. It certainly won't look the same, and I doubt that you could actually fill it up with water, because the consequences of it being broken will forever affect how it's used. He closes, the thing is, you're the only person who knows what those things are that you can't afford to drop. More than likely, they have a lot to do with your relationships, your marriage, your family, your kids, your friends. And I think intuitively we know that our relationships should be our highest priorities. And for Christians, there's one relationship that should supersede all other relationships, and that's our relationship with Jesus. And on the surface, the idea that we can have a personal relationship with Jesus is an incredible one. That we believe and that we think the Bible tells us that we can know the Creator of the universe and talk with Him and spend time with Him, and that He can have an influence on our lives, and that He speaks to us, and that it's possible to cultivate a deeper relationship with Him is one of the most beautiful truths of the Christian faith. And yet, if we're being honest, myself included, often when I look at where that relationship is on my priority list, where I give it the time and attention that I am, it often isn't getting what I know that it should, or I feel that it should, or even if I wanted to make a relationship with Jesus a bigger part of my life. There's plenty of times I've thought that, but then I just come to the realization I don't have time to really pursue a relationship with God right now. Maybe down the road, there will be less on my to-do list. There will be less demands from kids or friends or school or work, and eventually I'll be able to get to this. This is exactly the issue that we discover in Luke 10, where Jesus is trying to teach His disciples, 2 women in particular, on what should our priorities in life be if we're following Jesus. Luke 10:38. It's just a short story from the life of Jesus. Now as they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, him and his disciples, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. Now for most of Jesus' public ministry, he's on the move, and he's traveling from city to city. And one of the easy practical things to forget about is simply this. As Jesus was traveling, where was he staying? Who was feeding him? Who was taking care of his practical needs? And as you read the Gospels, you discover he's often just dependent on the hospitality of those who are aware of who he is. Now we know that he's in Bethany in Luke 10 because Martha is the one who comes to greet him. And one of the things that we discover throughout the Gospels is this. Martha was a part of a family that Jesus absolutely loved. Martha and her sister Mary and their brother Lazarus show up several times in the Gospels, and it becomes clear Jesus has deep affection for this family. That my guess is he was excited to be in Bethany this morning because it means he would be able to be with Martha and the rest of her family. He loved coming to Martha's house, I'm willing to bet. And so here's what happens in verse 39 and 40. And she had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went up to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her to help me." These sisters have two very different responses to Jesus' arrival. The first response, you have Mary, and as soon as Jesus comes in the house, what is she doing? She's sitting at the feet of Jesus. She's listening to his teaching. It looks like she doesn't have a care in the world at this moment other than hearing from the Lord. But that's not Martha's response to Jesus entering the house. The text says she was distracted with much serving. And I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, that Martha, like many of you or some of you, probably has the gift of hospitality. And you can imagine this, and I've seen this. My wife has the gift of hospitality. That whenever someone is coming over to the house, it's like this switch flips inside of her. Something happens the day company's coming over. And it's just like she immediately knows what to do. And she begins to get the house and everything in order. And she gets the lighting just right. And the candles come out. And there's these beautiful decorations and place settings. And more often than I'd like to admit, when company's coming over, she'd ask me to help set the table. And being a practically minded person, I might grab the nice paper plates. Because we can set them out, it's easier cleanup, there's not as much mess. Just you can imagine, there's good reasons to use that. And every time I walk from the kitchen into the dining room holding a stack of nice decorative paper plates, something inside of her dies. It's like I've wounded her soul at a deep level. And so she gets all this ready, and then the house is ready, and then she says, there's 2 or 3 people coming over. I'm just going to whip a quick snack up so we have something to eat before dinner. Now, I hear that, and I'm like, oh, she's going to put chips and salsa out. Oh, she's going to, put something small out. I actually have a picture. You may not be able to see it that well, but this is the kind of thing she would whip up as a quick snack for a group of people coming over. And if you can't see it very well, it's the biggest charcuterie board I've ever seen in my life. And 3 of us sit there before this huge dinner eating different meats and crackers and cheeses and jellies I've never heard of. And it just seems like a lot of effort for a couple of people coming over. But here's the thing. I know they feel cared for when they come to our house and all of that is done. And here's my guess. Martha had the kind of house. You wanted to go to Martha's dinner parties. You wanted to go to Martha's house when people were getting together for something because you knew you were going to be taken care of, and you knew things were going to be in order and the food was going to be good. And my wife, when she puts all this effort in, it's not work for her. She's trying to show her love for people in that way, and I think Martha's doing the same for Jesus. Imagine the pressure you'd feel preparing a dinner party for Jesus, and that's what Martha's dealing with here. And she wants him to feel cared for. She's trying to show her love for him through her service. And as she's trying to get all of this done, my guess is she's back and forth between rooms, sweat on her brow, a little out of breath. She's got 1,000 things to do before dinner. And she sees her sister every time she enters the room, just sitting there, just listening, not helping at all. Not hearing Martha's coughs, loud coughs as she walks through the room, not seeing the long stares from the kitchen as she's trying to get her attention. And finally, Martha has just had enough, and she doesn't even go to Mary. She goes to Jesus and says, "Jesus, tell her to help me." And Jesus' response to this might be interesting to some of us because it seems like a pretty reasonable request. Why should Martha be the only one getting the house ready right now? And in verse 41 we see, "But the Lord answered her, 'Martha, Martha, you're anxious and troubled about many things. One thing is necessary. Mary's chosen the good portion which will not be taken away from her.'" If we could have a face-to-face conversation with Jesus today, I wonder how many of us he would look at and say, "You're anxious and troubled about many things." That his response would be similar. I know that would probably be true of me, that for many of us, there is so much on our plate to be anxious about. There's so much on our calendars to be busied by that, if you just begin adding up the obligations and the commitments and the relationships and everything you've said yes to and everything you have to keep going regularly, it can be an incredibly daunting thing. Maybe there are things that don't even make you feel anxious, but they just take up so much time and attention. We don't have water on stage so that someone can grab a drink if they need it. Don't worry, we're following protocol and everything. But for me, as I conceptualize this was a helpful way for me to begin to think through these things. That as you think about the different obligations, responsibilities, things you've said yes to, just imagine that each one of these cups is some kind of responsibility that you have in this life. That maybe you have a spouse and that's one responsibility. That maybe you have a couple of kids and that adds a couple responsibilities. And it's not just that you had a couple of kids, but then those kids have school and everything to take care of with that. That then maybe those kids have a couple of extracurricular activities and that begins to fill up your calendar with more. And maybe it's not a spouse and kids, but maybe it's a handful of friends that you want to keep connected to and you need to keep those relationships good and you need space for meeting with them and talking with them and enjoying their company. And that doesn't even get to the things that I have to do at work, that I have a job, that maybe I'm in school. And it's not just that I go to work and I go to school, but I want to do really well in school. And so I have all this extra time I put into study. And I want my resume to look good. So I have all this extra time that I put into extracurriculars. Or I want to be the employee at work that everyone respects. And so I put in all the overtime. I say yes to everything that I get asked for. Or I'm the person in charge of the company. And I have to make sure that I'm putting in more time than other people. And you can see how this begins to stack up, just all of the different things that we have to keep going. That doesn't even mention, hey, I've got a couple hobbies I'm passionate about and want to pursue, that there needs to be some time in my life for entertainment. And so I've got my shows that I like to watch, and I've got my movies that I like to watch, and you begin to keep working through these things. For many of you who are here, you have some kind of spiritual life. And so I want to make sure that I prioritize time for church, but not just church. I need a small group to be in, and there's ministries that need help serving, and there's people that need help in our church, and I want to have time to meet with them and to share with them what I can, and quickly, before you know it, a table full of good things is completely full. And you begin to feel the press of this. Some of you look at your calendars right now, as you look at your to-do list right now, you're feeling the weight of this, because not only do these cups represent things that you have to do, plates that you have to keep spinning, but in a very real way, it's things that you have to pour part of yourself into. Nothing could go wrong putting this on worship equipment, right? So, Zach, don't worry. And so I want you to imagine one other thing, and I think this is probably how some of you feel this morning. That as I fill this cup up with water, this water, let it represent the energy that you have, the time that you have, the attention that you have, what you're able to put into all of these things that we've just laid out here. And so we have a finite amount of it. And so like I said, you've got that spouse. You have to be able to give something to your spouse. You have to be able to give something to your kids, and you want to make sure they have time. You have to make sure you're doing a good job at work. You have to make sure I'm making time for spiritual things. And before you know it, without much effort at all, you've lost a lot of that energy and that focus and that your attention you're able to give other things. And there's so much in your life that hasn't even received attention at this point. And so we go through and we're trying to make sure I have just enough. I need just enough sleep. I need just enough free time to keep me going so I can fill other people up. But before we realize it, for most of us, we get to this place where we have 100 things in our life that need our attention and nothing left to give them. And part of the frustration we feel, part of the anxiety we feel is there's stuff I've said yes to, I need to take care of. And the frustration we feel is the frustration of trying to take care of those things, but I don't feel like I have anything to give. And I don't have time for another conversation or another task at work or something else on my calendar, but I can't let any of these things go. And what we realize is most of us are living life like this, anxious and frustrated, and we're trying to find ways to fill ourselves up so we have more to give. And sometimes we have a good conversation with a friend and it gives us a little bit, or we have a good date night with a spouse and it gives us a little bit, but it's not enough to give us what we need to take care of everything going on in our life. But sometimes we get to go on a vacation. And we can get away from all of this for a couple of weeks, and we go somewhere else, and we get away from responsibilities and obligations, and we're feeling good coming back, and for a couple of weeks, things are fine. But then we get back to the 9 to 5, and quickly that whatever it is that we had, that joy that we found in getting away from all of this is quickly gone, and we're left just thinking, I can't wait till there's another trip. Eventually you realize the trips aren't going to do it, and it's just, I can't wait until I can retire and finally fill this thing up again. And for many of us, as we look at our lives, we feel this way, and there's one glaring omission from this table: a relationship with God. Now, there's spiritual things on the table, and here's what I want to be clear about. There's church, there's a small group, there's service opportunities. But it's possible, and we're going to see this in Luke chapter 10, to do those kinds of religious things, to do religious activities, and not have a relationship with God. And so typically, here's what happens. We hear a sermon like this, and we immediately feel guilty. How do I get God on the table? And you think about a relationship with God, and it doesn't just feel like any other cup, it feels like something like this. And so we leave here Sunday morning, and we're going to go home this afternoon and think, I want a relationship with God, and we begin looking for, where can I fit this on the table? Where can I put that? How can I squeeze God in a little bit and get Him on here? And we quickly realize that other things are beginning to fall, and it's tough to add anything else to an already jammed priorities and calendar and schedule. And for most of us, here's what happens. We try and live like this for a few weeks, balancing everything that we can, keeping God on the table, until eventually it's just too hard, or we don't know how to do it, and so God gets put to the side again until there's another sermon like this, or until there's a retreat, or until there's an event. And then we try and do this whole thing again. And the question becomes, is there a better way to do this? Is there a better way to live life right now than the way in which many of us are living it? Because I think most of us would admit we feel constantly anxious and frustrated and tired, and we're looking for joy and happiness and satisfaction in all of these things. And yet over and over and over again, we're discovering they're not offering us what we are looking for. They're not giving us what we think they should. And as we look at verse 41, I think Jesus' invitation to Martha this morning is an invitation that He's making to every single person in this room today. That again, look at verse 41 with me. I think if Jesus was here in this room this morning, He would say this to many of us, and where He says, Martha, Martha, I just want you to take a second and read that verse and put your name in the verse, because I think that's what Jesus would do this morning. As I read this passage, reading verse 41, Eric. One of the things I want to make clear as we see where Jesus takes this passage is this: He is not trying to guilt Martha into what He's about to tell her. He's not condemning her into what He's about to say to her. That the encouragement that Jesus is about to give Martha and to me and to you comes from a place of compassion and care. That when you doubled someone's name like this in the first century, you were expressing the deep love that you felt for a person. In Matthew 23, when Jesus is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, he closes it this way, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." Why? Because he cared about the city. Why does he repeat Martha's name? He cares about Martha. And why would he repeat our name in a context like this? Because he does care about us and our experience in this life, and ultimately our life with him. And I think that as he began to speak to us today, we would discover that, like Martha, we are anxious and troubled about many things. Many of you this week probably anxious and troubled about many things. But Jesus' reminder is simply this. It's a singular reminder. One thing in this life is necessary. One thing is the good portion, he says here. One thing, he tells Martha, we can pursue in this life, and it will never be taken away from us. That's what we're all looking for, something worth investing in that we will never lose, because as we saw in Ecclesiastes throughout the fall, we lose so much throughout this life. And the good portion that Jesus is describing here is prioritizing life with him. Again, not prioritizing religious activity, but life with Jesus. Prioritizing sitting at his feet and listening to his teaching and learning from his word. It's having a conversation with Jesus. It's hearing from him. It's growing into this real experience of life with God, because it's possible to have life with God today. But where this gets really tricky is this: for us to have room for that, to have room for the good portion, to have room for the one thing that's necessary that Jesus talks about here in Luke 10. It means that we're going to have to radically reorganize and reorient our lives, or at least that's what I've had to do to begin to experience some measure of this. I'm far from figuring it out. At a very basic level, it means that to say yes to Jesus in terms of living with him day to day, having room to sit at his feet as Mary did in Luke chapter 10. Some of the cups have to go. Some of the way that we organize our life has to go. That trying to squeeze Jesus into an already full schedule never works long term. That's never a solid plan for spiritual growth or an experience of Jesus. And often when Jesus is the thing getting squeezed onto the table around other things, that when life gets even busier, he will be the first thing to go, if that's our approach to the spiritual life. And I'm as guilty as this as many other people. So don't hear me pointing a finger this morning. This has been one of the most convicting things I've been working through over the past few months, is if life with Jesus is going to be the most important thing to me, what needs to change about my life, about my priorities, about my schedule? That I talk to so many well-intentioned Christians who tell me over and over again, a time is coming, I'm going to get serious about my faith, and life will slow down, and there will be openings in my schedule to make this a priority. That I'd love to spend more time in the Bible once this semester is over, once this big project is done at work, once my kids are into a new phase of life, I'll have time for it. I wish we could make it to church more, and once this season is done or the schedule slows down, once we've traveled a little more, we'll be able to pick it back up a little bit. I wish I could spend time in prayer, but my life is just so busy. There's so many demands. My kids need so much. My friends need so much. My spouse needs so much. I want to have a relationship with God, but where am I supposed to find the time for this? And again, as we hear Jesus' words, this is not a text trying to guilt trip us in to change our lives, but it's this, that as we think about what life with Jesus could mean, the reason Jesus confronts Martha on this is this: he wants what's best for Martha. Jesus doesn't put a burden on Martha's shoulders here. This is how I feel like some of you, this is how I used to come out of sermons like this. An already crazy to-do list, and here's one more thing to throw on top, and it feels like this crushing weight on my shoulders. Jesus isn't trying to add one more thing to Martha's to-do list. Jesus wants Martha to find joy in this life, and to not be anxious, and to not be troubled by many things. But Jesus knows for that to be a reality, Martha has to change her approach to life. She has to change her priorities, or she's not going to find what she's looking for in everything else that's going on in her life. Many of us have this longing that we're trying to fill with accomplishments and relationships and more income and more travel, and there's nothing wrong with those things, and they can bring us some happiness in this life. But when Jesus promised his disciples in John 6:35, Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst." And I think there's a lot of Christians, myself included, who read a text like that and have a very different Christian experience than, in my life with God, in my spiritual life. I feel like I'm finding this satisfaction that Jesus is describing. I'm finding this lack of hunger and lack of thirst because Jesus is filling me to such a degree. And so what's the disconnect between the promise of Jesus and my actual experience of the Christian life? Maybe it's a deficiency in God. I doubt that's the answer. And I think to a larger degree it's simply this, that maybe the reason we're not finding the joy, finding the satisfaction, maybe the reason our hunger isn't being fed is we're simply not coming to Him to have that done. That how often are we sitting at His feet? How often do we take the posture of Mary and prioritize being ministered to in the presence of God? Because what happens when we come, when we start prioritizing time in the Word and prioritizing prayer and silence and solitude and worship and spiritual disciplines and all of these tools that God has given us to sit in a place where we can be ministered to by the Lord, when we do prioritize those things, and in the times in my life when I have prioritized those things, I do find myself being filled up. And it doesn't mean life is perfect. It doesn't mean life necessarily gets easier, but I do begin to find some measure of the joy that Jesus promised, that as I sit in the presence of Jesus, I'm given more peace, that my sins have been forgiven by His death on the cross, that I've been made right with God because of what He's done through His life, death, and resurrection, that I'm given assurance and a new identity, that I'm a child of God, and that I have this power available to me, that a lot of life feels like we don't have the resources we need to live it. And part of the promise of Jesus is this: I will give you power you don't have on your own. I will give you my Spirit. You will have supernatural power at work in you. But how often do we lean into these things? That maybe for some of us, and this is kind of the last phase of this sermon, what we need to realize today is this: the thing we're missing, the thing we're lacking as we start 2021, is a growing relationship with Jesus. And we're all going to start from different places, and we're all going to be at different maturity levels. But maybe the thing that all of us are looking for, there's no way I'm going to do this without spilling some of this, that maybe the thing all of us are looking for, that longing that you're feeling, maybe this is your first time in church in a long time, and you thought the new year would be a good chance to try and reignite some of that, and we're so glad that you're here, is: how do I begin to prioritize time with God? And it means we're going to have to take a step back and be willing in a very hard way to assess, what do our lives look like? What am I saying yes to? What does my to-do list look like? And how can I get my life to a place where I really am beginning to prioritize life with God? And for many of us, it's going to come down to this: are we willing to clear the deck? Look at everything that we've said yes to. Now, some things you've said yes to, you can't say no to, like a spouse and kids and work. We have obligations we can't say no to. But what would it look like to clear the table of our lives, to assess what do we want our lives to look like, and say, at the very center of who I am, I want life with God. And this is my non-negotiable. And we see all that He has to offer us and fill us with. That this is going to be the thing that, regardless of anything else that happens in my life, this is the thing I'm not moving. Now, this will look different for everyone. What life with Jesus for you, based on, things you can't change, will look different for everybody. But to say, this is the thing at the center of who I am. And as we begin to pursue life with God, to say, you know what, I'm going to prioritize life with God, and I'm going to spend more time in His Word this year. And I'm going to begin to cultivate a meaningful prayer life in my own life. And I'm going to prioritize worshiping with the people of God. And I'm going to really seek after people who can help me cultivate a growing relationship with Jesus. And again, in the midst of that, we have things we can't say no to. Maybe it is a spouse. Maybe it is a couple of kids that we're pouring ourselves into. We need a couple of friends who we can really begin to invest in. But as we begin to put things back on the table, God's at the center, and then I need to fill out my life with other things. Fill out my life with other things that need prioritized. We're going to have to ask some hard questions about how we add these things back to the table. If you're a student, maybe it's this: how much studying do I really need to do? If I get a 94 instead of 100, but I have time to pursue a relationship with Jesus, is that a worthwhile sacrifice to make? That for some of us, we'll have to ask this: how much extra time and effort do I really need to put in at work? I want to be a good employee. I want to be a good boss. When is enough enough? When has it moved from I'm doing the work that God has given me to I'm just feeding this endless need for accomplishment in my life? When is enough income enough? When is enough title and prestige enough, if it means this can stay at the center? Then maybe for some of us, the hard thing is going to be this: how many extracurriculars do me and the kids really need to be doing? How many things that I've said yes to on the schedule are enough? Am I teaching them in the way that I'm scheduling my own kids' life that Jesus should be at the center of their lives, or that He's the thing to squeeze in when we have a little bit of leftover time? How much entertainment do I actually need? That I think if most of us were honest, we have more time to put this in the center that we realize, but we just, for so many of us, and this is true of me far too often, life just kind of happens to me and I'm not running my life. I'm not putting things in the place that they need to be in order to make the main thing the main thing. Again, maybe we need to look at our lives this morning and simply remove the things that are sucking time and energy but aren't getting us any closer to Jesus. This can be a hard thing to do. I had to do this recently. And I want to be clear, I don't say this is a right and wrong thing. This wasn't even a sin issue in my life. But as I looked at my own life and where my time was going and where my priorities were, I just had to completely get off social media the last few weeks. And I don't plan on going back. And for me, it was just as I assessed every Sunday morning as I'm up here preaching and my phone reminds me how much time I was on my phone this week, which is a convicting thing to do in the middle of a sermon, but it happens every week. I just realized I was losing days of my life to endless scrolling. Not just time, but attention and worry, that I would hear about something that happened in another state, in another country. I'm not saying there are events that aren't important. There are important things happening in the world. But even the smallest thing I would become aware of, and it would just chew up all of my time and my attention. And then I would have to check on those things as I discovered that they were happening. Things that had zero bearing on my life were pressing in. And I had to make, again, the decision for myself. Some of you can probably handle it better than I could. It made me realize that there had been years of my life where maybe I was physically present with my wife and my kids, even at church some Sundays. But my mind was somewhere else because I was constantly allowing the outside world to encroach in through a phone. And so I finally had to begin to say no to some things. And I remember the first few days where I was off, I would find myself unconsciously sitting at my desk, reaching for my phone. There's nothing there to check. There's nothing to look at. My body had to be weaned off of it. And it was a little bit of an embarrassing thing for me to experience, just how addicted I had become to it. And that's not to say that's been a cure-all, and that doesn't mean that the goal of all this is to have 24/7 quiet times or only spend time with Jesus. That what I'm talking about is simply this: do you have space in your life to grow in a relationship with Jesus? Is that the most important thing? If it is, your life will look different than everyone's life around you. Your priorities will look different than the world around you. People are going to get ahead in some ways that you won't, because you're choosing the better portion, if we believe that Jesus actually is the better portion. One of the most convicting statements I've read in the past few months is from Henry Nouwen, who's a theologian some of you may have heard of, who simply said this: without solitude, it's virtually impossible to live a spiritual life. We do not take the spiritual life seriously if we do not set aside some time to be with God and listen to Him. And I realized as I talked with my wife, as I thought through these things, as I worked through a text like this, that I really wasn't taking my life with God seriously, because there was, most days, no space for that to happen. No opportunity for that to happen. And so again, as we begin to work through this, the band can come up. We're going to sing here in a second. How many of us have any quiet space at all in our lives right now? It sounds weird, but you have to fight for that space. Not quiet for the sake of quiet, not rest for the sake of rest, but those spaces that we can begin to listen to Jesus and to pursue and think about what does it mean to live life with Him. One of the weirdest things that some of you might need to cut out, and this will sound very backwards coming from a pastor, maybe some of you need to stop doing so much religious stuff. And here's what I mean by that. It's possible for Christians to begin to do so much, to be in so many Bible studies, and to be serving on so many ministry teams, and to be in so many small groups, and to attend so many services, that in the midst of all your religious activity, there's no time for you to grow personally with Jesus. Now that sounds weird, but that's a place I've been in. There's a way in which ministry can keep you from a growing relationship with Jesus. Now, that's not to say we don't prioritize gathering with God's people for this, or finding ways to serve, or we need that Christian community, but do we have that in our lives? And it's okay to say no to other spiritual things if it means we're using the tools that God has given us and we have room to grow closer to Jesus. On average in a church, 20% of people do 80% of the work. There's 20% of you in this room who need to start telling us no more. Because you don't have space to get closer to Jesus because you're doing so much stuff. And I can see all our ministry team leaders right now kind of tensing up at the thought that they're going to have some volunteers say, maybe I need to do less. But when the 20 begin to say no, hopefully, the 80 will begin to step in and say, how can I take this off someone's plate because they're doing 8 things and I'm not engaged yet, but I want to begin serving in this way, and we can benefit everybody when we all begin to approach this in a healthy way. Our life with God at the center looks something like this. Psalm 107:9, David discovers He satisfies the longing soul, and the hungry soul He fills with good things. That's what I want for my life. To feel that satisfaction, to experience that satisfaction with God. And as we begin to prioritize life with God, as we begin to get in the Word and find opportunities to worship, as we sit daily in the presence of Jesus, we get filled with these good things, maybe even without realizing it. But for this to happen, it's going to require intentional, focused, scheduled time to make that happen. Pastor Tim Keller notes our souls need more than drive-through encounters with Jesus, which is what I've had for a lot of my life. That I know I need time with Jesus, and so I do just enough to feel good checking off time with Jesus on my list, but I'm not sitting with Him. It's been a long time since I've fit in a bathtub, but for those of you who, if you remember being a kid and taking a bath, I tried to get Jesse to make me a bath as an adult once, and I realized quickly, I was not made for bathtubs of standard size. But you remember, I've got kids, and they'll be in the bathtub long enough, and they know they've been in the bathtub long enough. Why? Because their skin begins to get pruny. The water begins to change them because they've been sitting in it for so long. Maybe here's our goal for 2021 at City of God. We're probably not going to put this on any promotional material, but how do we begin to get spiritually pruny? That's not going to work for social media, is it, TJ? That won't be the tagline, but am I sitting with Jesus long enough? And this will happen if you sit with Him, if you grow closer to Him. It will begin to change you when He's not one other obligation on a list filled with obligations, but when He is the priority. And think of what life could be like if at the center of who we are and everything that we do is I'm prioritizing being filled with good things from Jesus. And so I have something to give my spouse. I have something to give my kids. I have something to give at work. But then it's not the frantic searching for something more. I know where to find what I'm looking for. And with a manageable amount of things in my life, I can pour into them and pour into my church and pour into the people around me. But I constantly know where I'm coming back to, where I am most often, the thing that's going to fill me with good things. And life is no longer frantic. It's not going to be easy. It's not magically going to make your life perfect. But this is a very different experience than how most of us are trying to get through this life, pouring out every little last drop we have without allowing the one who made the universe to fill us with good things. And then in turn, we have something to pour out for others and the obligations and the people in our life. There's a way to find joy in the Lord in the midst of a world that refuses to slow down, but it requires us to stop. As one author said about this story, it's as if Mary plants her feet down in a river that's flowing and begins to walk against the current. It's going to take that kind of resolve to make this a reality. And as we leave this morning, we're asking, will we go through this life like Martha, constantly worrying, constantly working, maybe even on good things, constantly distracted, constantly anxious, never choosing the good portion? Or will we put life with Jesus at the center and a manageable amount of things around him? And if we will begin to do this, I promise you, you're going to start finding what you're looking for in this life. I've just had a taste of it recently, and this is my goal for 2021. I'm going to pray and we'll sing. Father, thank you for this morning and our time together. God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the care that you have for us. We thank you for the ways that you constantly point us back to you. And God, I pray that over the next few minutes, you would help all of us ask the questions we need to be asking. What are my priorities in this life? God, if someone's a Christian and you haven't been the priority, I pray that you would convict them of that sin and that your Spirit would bring them to a place of change. Maybe not that they would have all of life figured out or everything would magically fall into place, but they would know what's supposed to be most important. Father, thank you for saving us, for loving us, for giving us the assurance that we seek, for making possible the life that we're looking for everywhere else. Help us find it in you this year. Father, we love you. We ask this all in your Son's name. Amen.